You know, as someone who's interested in archaeology and history, I've also always been kind of fascinated with place names. And I don't know if you have too, but I've been fascinated with the way place names kind of record these little fragments of history that are otherwise lost. And when you think about it, from Mayaca to Miami, from Okeechobee to Ocala, the modern sort of political geography of peninsular Florida just rings with the name of its native peoples. And in many cases, you know, those names are all we have because historical records provide only these names. Any further descriptions of the people or the chiefs and the towns for which the chiefs were usually, the towns were usually named after the chiefs, have been lost to historical memory, to the epidemic diseases, slave raiding, and sort of imperial expansion that accompanied the Spanish and then the British and then the Spanish again, and then American territorial expansion into Peninsula Florida. So in this talk, I'm talking about research aimed at kind of recovering the memory of one of these towns that we have a name for, but not much else. Although we do have at least a little bit more of this town, Tokabaga, than we do of a lot of the others toponyms that are around Florida. The name Tokabaga still lives on around Tampa Bay, especially in the north half of the bay, I suppose, but you can find businesses around Tampa that adopt the name Tokabaga, make use of it. Probably most famously is craft beer, Tokabaga Red Ale made by Cigar City. But the name is not as common or as well known as it should be. Indeed, if it weren't for some historical accident, we'd all be living around Tokabaga Bay, because the historian John Worth has documented the fact that the town, the native town of Tampa, was actually located much further south than the bay. It was down closer to Fort Myers. Tokabaga, at least in the 1500s, was the principal native town in Tampa Bay, and rightfully should be the namesake of Tampa Bay, but you know, that's the way historical names go. So in any case, the ruins of the town of Tokabaga are presumed to lie at the archaeological site that we now know as Safety Harbor, which is near the modern town of Safety Harbor at the northern end of Tampa Bay. And the site lies in Philippe Park, which is Pinellas County's first public park. The identification of Safety Harbor with the Tokabaga village is based on a couple Spanish accounts. Primarily this description by the secretary, Solis de Maris, of the first Spanish governor, Pedro Menendez de Aviles. And the description is that they're sailing up from the Calusa capital, where they had a mission down near Naples. And they say that they sailed up, and the cacique, the chief, lived 20 leagues inland from the mouth of the bay, and one could sail up close to the side of his house by a channel of salt water. And so the location of the Safety Harbor site matches that description pretty well in other descriptions, in other Spanish accounts. 40 nautical miles from the Gulf of Mexico is about equivalent to the 20 leagues estimated by the Spanish. And the Safety Harbor site, as I'll show in a second, has a large, there's still an extant large platform mound that is kind of unusual in that it lies on a bluff right by the water. So it's consistent with this idea that the Spanish could sail right up by the chief's house, assuming the chief lived on top of the mound. So visitors to the site today, because it's in a public park, you can walk actually a paved ramp to the top of the mound. And this is the location where in 1567, the Spanish governor met with the chief, Tocobaga, and the chief's rival, Carlos, the king of the Calusa. And the Mount Summit is also, if you haven't been there before, it's a very nice park, and it's a good place to kind of like look back and imagine how the town of Tocobaga might have looked when the Spanish arrived on that day in 1567. Although that is a challenge, given that it's now a public park, and as I'll show pictures in a second, there are picnic shelters built on a lot of this, on the former village. The mound has been landscaped. There's a lot of pavement. So, but it's still kind of extraordinary that so much of the town of Tokabaga which is at least 500 years old, still persists in terms of archaeology. So, I won't go much into theory, but the way I'm looking at Tokabaga is from the perspective of a concept called ruination. The root of this, of course, is ruins, and it makes sense to think about archaeological sites as ruins, right? Even though when we think about ruins, we tend to think about like Greek temples or Mayan pyramids, right? But ruins are perfectly appropriate for a mound site like Tokabaga. But I also mean ruination in the sense of a verb, like how things get ruined, right? And specifically how ruins persist in these kind of colonial landscapes as Spanish, British, French, and American kind of imperial expansion. So in this sense, ruination is kind of a political project where ruins are kind of appropriated for particular purposes. And so, you know, if you think about it, the ruination of Tokabaga really started the day that the Spanish governor Menendez de Avalos and Carlos landed on the shores adjacent to the chief's house. This was not the Tokabaga's first encounter with the Spanish. Menendez was able to communicate with the Tokabagan people because they had a shipwreck survivor, a Spanish shipwreck survivor, who had been held captive in the town for 6 years. And it's possible that the village of Tokabaga was visited even before 1567. Some people think it was where it might have been visited by Pánfilo de Narváez as early as 1528. But this was definitely the most sustained interaction they had with the Spanish, who now intended to kind of reinscribe that native town of Tokabaga as a Spanish town and a Spanish mission. And this was also not Tokabaga's first encounter with the Calusa chief, Carlos. At the time of his visit to Tokabaga, Carlos's sister and 12 of his Calusa subjects were being held captive by the Tokabaga chief. So there was probably like a long-standing enmity, feud between Tokabaga and Tepa Bay and Carlos, the Calusa chief to the south. And Carlos, of course, just like the Spanish, probably aimed to reinscribe Tokabaga as his own subject under a different name and establish, expand their control from southern Florida into central Florida. So anyway, before the Spanish governor departed, he left a contingent of about 30 soldiers, and they built a mission fort, a kind of wall, a rough kind of wall of brushwood and timber. And the Spanish governor departed for their main mission back in the Calusa territory near Naples. And the intention, of course, of the Spanish was to convert the native people of Tokabaga to Christianity, but the Tokabaga chief, and especially the chief, were really fiercely resistant to Christianity. The Spanish record how at one point the chief says he would prefer to throw himself and his family into the fire rather than to see their idols burned. So the conversion didn't go real well right from the beginning. And when Menendez and his priests go back to the Calusa mission, they start hearing reports that things aren't going well with the Tokabaga mission. There's heavy rains that apparently ruined the meager provisions that they were getting from Havana, making the Spanish soldiers that were stationed at Tokabaga an even heavier burden than they normally would have been on the native people there in the town. And later accounts also indicate the Spanish chief was getting reports that the Spanish soldiers that were left at Tokabaga were treating the Indians poorly, harshly, physically threatening the Indians. So when the priest, Father Rohel, returns to Tokabaga less than a year later with Menendez's governor, who's a lieutenant, they discover that all the Spanish soldiers have been killed, and the town has been deserted. And so the Spanish burned the town in retaliation. And that is largely where the Tokabaga disappeared from the historical record. They do pop up occasionally later, but they're living in North Florida by this point in the 1600s, and they're kind of on the fringe of one of the missions up in North Florida. And then they disappear kind of entirely from the historical record anyway. It seems likely, to me at least, that those last Tokabaga refugees living on the fringe of those missions were absorbed either by force or by their own will into some of the what we call coalescent or tribal societies that were forming that we now know as like the Creeks and the Seminoles, that were kind of like sucking up a lot of the refugee populations that were left in the wake of Spanish colonialism. But while the people of Tokabaga and the town of Tokabaga might have been erased by this Spanish imperialism in the 1700s, the ruins of the village started attracting the attention of some of the early settlers to Tampa Bay. The early settlers to Tampa Bay were often attracted to the former native towns where mounds were present, and the mounds offered like good places to live and prominent vistas so they could survey the bay. So in the case of Tokabaga, the ruins of the village attracted this kind of larger than life settler of Tampa Bay called Philippe. And as Smitty mentioned, there are a lot of stories about Philippe. He's said to be a childhood friend of Napoleon, and hence the name of his plantation, Santa Helena. He's said to be the first European settler of Pinellas County. He's said to be the first to cultivate citrus in Florida, the first to introduce cigar rolling to Florida, or to Tampa Bay, and a friend of the legendary, probably imaginary pirate Jose Gaspar. So there are lots of stories about him, and most of them are probably not true. What is probably true, thanks to the historical research of one of his descendants, is that he was probably an African American or of Afro-American, Afro-Caribbean descent. Rather than being from France, he was probably from the French colony of Haiti. And he was also a slave owner. He owned 5 slaves himself. In any case, this town of Tokabaga was reinscribed as this plantation of Santa Helena. In the early 20th century, the town of Tokabaga got reinscribed again as the safety harbor site, as it came to the attention of archaeologists. Now, in the early 20th century, it's worth bearing in mind that archaeology was really just getting started as a discipline, right? And it hadn't developed a really fully mature methodology. Its attitude was really kind of more akin to the antiquarians of the 1800s who were fascinated with burials and objects and grave goods, right? So in the late 1920s, the Safety Harbor site came to the attention of an archaeologist at the Smithsonian Institution by the name of Matthew Sterling. And typical of the day, Sterling was attracted, he went straight to the burial mound, and he dug the hell out of the burial mound. Almost completely excavated it, excavated the remains of several hundred people in a very short amount of time. The kind of excavation that makes archaeologists and of course Native Americans kind of cringe at how sloppy it must have been, right? Those human remains, some of them got carted back to the Smithsonian. A lot of them looked like they were left kind of laying around. And there are stories in Safety Harbor of farmers picking up some of the human bones and grinding them up to use as fertilizers in the fields around St. So it's an unfortunate chapter in the story. To add kind of insult to injury, the Sterling's excavations in the 1920s also attracted a person who would come to be like America's most famous or infamous snake oil salesman. A guy by the name of Curtis Springer Howe. And he attached himself to Sterling's excavations. He didn't have any formal training, but he claimed to be an anatomist. And he used that as a platform to give lectures describing sort of the inferiority of Native Americans. Springer would eventually market a snake oil called antediluvian tea, maybe inspired by his time on the archaeological excavation. We can't say for sure. So, despite its poor beginnings, the archaeology did mature as a discipline over the course of the 1900s. Into the middle 20th century, archaeology started to turn into a real scientific enterprise. And the artifacts from Safety Harbor attracted the attention of a rising star in archaeology by the name of Gordon Willey. Now, Gordon Willey would go on to great fame in archaeology. He's probably the most famous archaeologist of the 20th century, at least in America. He went on to greater fame for his work in Mesoamerica, but he really cut his teeth working on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and that's what he did his dissertation at Harvard on. And so he recognized the importance of the artifacts that Sterling had excavated from Safety Harbor, and he used them to define the Safety Harbor period, this late period of prehistory in Tampa Bay from 1000 to 1500 or so, which is the kind of the local equivalent of what we know as Mississippian in the Southeast. And he described the Safety Harbor pottery type based on the collections from Sterling's excavations, which is mostly plain pottery, as a lot of the pottery around Tampa Bay is, but it has tick marks and incise lines and punctations occasionally. I think there's a picture there from Willie. So again, Safety Harbor is Tokabaga is reinscribed again, this time as a type site for the Safety Harbor culture and pottery type. Additional excavations were conducted in 1948 by two of Florida's most famous archaeologists, John Griffin and Ripley Bullen, and they did good work. This was in anticipation of the development of the park. Griffin and Bullen excavated the trench on the mound, and they summarized the results in much more detail than Sterling had done in a brief but pretty informative report, where they laid out for the first time what the village or what the site looked like. This is the main platform mound that's still extant, and then they described the village as being kind of an L centered on that platform mound with a probable plaza in this flat area. And then they mapped in the location where Sterling's burial mound was, unusually kind of far away from the village. And they also appeared to have been the first to really connect the Safety Harbor site with the Spanish mission and the town of Tocobaga, because they found some Spanish artifacts themselves. They also had collectors who brought artifacts from the site to them. And these line up pretty well. There's a Portuguese coin that fits the period of the Spanish mission quite well, and then there's Spanish ceramics too that fit that too. So they kind of made a case for it being the village of Tokabaga and the site of the Spanish mission. Additional excavations were conducted in the late 1960s by a local historical society. Unfortunately, the results of these excavations were never published, and more unfortunately, the artifacts were never properly curated and have since been kind of dispersed and lost to the point where they're not really good for much anymore. So, that's the archaeological chapter of the story. Now, as I mentioned, the park was created in 1948, and while archaeologists were mostly concerned with the ruins of Tocobaga, it was the ruins of the Philippe Plantation that were celebrated with the creation of the park. This sign was erected in 1948, and it kind of repeats the legend of Philippe and kind of positions him as a kind of an influential settler in Pinellas County and in Tampa Bay more generally. In another strange chapter in this story of this site, they erected a fake grave for Philippe in the park. And they also spelled his name wrong on the grave marker. Why they did this, I have no idea, but eventually some descendants got him to correct the name change, or to change the name on the headstone. But I think a lot of visitors to the park still assume that this is a real grave, when there's actually no one buried there. And history kind of took a backstage, you could say, as the park was created. Philippe's story, although I guess you could say it was kind of a selected version of history that was presented. Philippe's story was reenacted for visitors to the park in a stage production at the base of the Mound in the 1950s. And you can see it started off, you can see from these historical newspapers, it started off really focused on Philippe, the orange tree, but again, it's got the pirate element. This is not a real clear picture, but they have to play up the pirate element. Later, they got more ambitious, and they switched the drama production from the story of Philippe, and they landed a production of a drama that was called Florida Aflame. And it was the story of the Seminole removal told with all white actors. And they built a much larger amphitheater right on top of part of the village. So you can see part of the production here. I don't know if anybody's been here, but the mound's up kind of on the top left in this corner. You can't really see the mound, it's covered in trees. So they had great expectations for this, but kind of not surprisingly, the audiences were always kind of meager, and they eventually sort of dwindled to the point that the shows had to be discontinued. And sort of recreation took center stage over history, a little bit of history that was being presented. And in service of recreation, they put a paved ramp up to the top of the platform mound. They landscaped the backside of the platform mound along the bay. It's extensively terraced with, a walkway that leads up to the top. The plaza area is now covered by a parking lot. And there's a picnic shelter and a children's playground on top of where the burial mound is. So if you're going to Safety Harbor and you plan to have a picnic, my advice is to avoid picnic shelter number 9. Might be some bad juju there. So that's kind of the story of Safety Harbor's ruination. But as I said earlier, the material remains of the town of Tokabaga persist, despite all those forces that have come to try to erase them. So archaeological and historical research documents kind of the process of how Tokabaga was transformed into a ruin, but also kind of provide a means of remembering Tokabaga, right? By revealing sort of the physical remains of the town and how it got superimposed by different layers of meaning over time. So that is how I've approached the study of Tokabaga, kind of peeling back the layers, almost thinking of it kind of an onion with these layers that have been added over time and getting back to that core of the town of Tokabaga. And it's, it's pretty basic archaeological research. Now, recognizing that it's a protected site, Safety Harbor. The Safety Harbor site is actually a National Historic Landmark and Pinellas County's only National Historic Landmark. So we're approaching it kind of cautiously and sort of judiciously. We're using things like ground penetrating radar, other types of geophysical survey, like radiometer here, to help us kind of get a window on what's buried beneath the surface without a lot of digging, right? And so this is kind of just a preliminary statement of results because a lot of the research is ongoing. For the kind of cliche in archaeology is that for every day in the field you have 3 or 4 or 5 days in the lab, and that's more than a cliche. It's really true. So I'm just going to give you an inkling of the results. Now, this is some of the GPR results. And so the big mound is here, and remember the village is supposed to be kind of L-shaped, but you've got a parking lot and a big picnic shelter here. This is where the amphitheater used to be. But what you can see, and this word of explanation, so the GPR, you take the GPR and you run it in lines, but then there are computer programs that can interpolate horizontal surfaces at different depths. So this is kind of at a shallow depth, 12 to 25 centimeters below the surface. This is where at this site we see a lot of the shell didn't show up. And so in the GPR results, the red, the yellow, those are things that are really reflective. And in a lot of cases, in this case, much of that is shell buried below the surface. And you can see that the results kind of suggest a pattern consistent with the way the village was mapped, with a lot of shell coming out this way and a lot of shell coming up that way, where the two arms of the village are supposed to go. You can also, of course, see things that don't look like Native American features, like these sort of very linear lines are probably utility lines that are buried across the site. But that's good to know too. This is getting a little deeper in the GPR. This is 35 to 45 centimeters below surfaces, and this is where we tend to see feature, when we're excavating, this is where we tend to see features show up. And so, again, these reds and yellows are where the radar is getting more reflection, which indicates there might be features of certain kinds there. And so some of these could be pits, post holes, those kind of features. Of course, some of them could also be modern disturbances to the park, or associated with the park. This is the gradiometer result. It's more black and white, but you get the gradiometer is picking up magnetism. So, and magnetism can be, of course, buried metal, but it can also be the result of human activities, where there's a lot of where people leave behind a lot of trash. It changes the magnetic qualities of the soil. So we can pick out sort of midden deposits with the gradiometer based on magnetism too. So again, though, like with the GPR, some of these are probably Native American features associated with Tokabaga. A lot of them are associated with probably modern park disturbances. So the geophysical survey really helps to get an idea where things are buried, but you know, there's still no substitute for doing a little excavation at some point. We've also done some work, you know, that's some of the work in the village we've done. We're also doing a little bit of work in the mound, just to try to date the mound. So here's my colleague from the University of Georgia starting to take a soil core. And we've taken the soil core, it's, you know, it's a small diameter core, but it provides a window on the different soil layers within the mound. And if we get lucky, we can pick out things in those soil layers that we can date with radiocarbon dating and actually figure out how the mound was built over time. And we can combine that, we're still in the kind of the early stages, but can try to combine that with the GPR results. So this is a GPR from the mound. I'm not sure if this is going to play. No, it doesn't play. So it's actually animated, but it's not going to work, I guess. But you can see this is at the top of the mound on the right, and you can see some dense shell layers towards the top of the mound, and then you've got breaks, and then you've got more dense shell layers that are more reflective. So we're matching up the GPR from the mound with the soil core, and then tying in the dates, and we'll be able to kind of like indicate how the mound was constructed over time. Now, as I was saying, you know, there's no substitute for digging, but we're keeping it fairly modest. So we're doing shovel test excavations. Shovel tests are, in Florida, are 50 centimeter squares, so they're about 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet. Small excavations, then we screen the soil and collect the artifacts. And we've done about 60 of these, 60 or 70 of these at 20-meter intervals across the site. And this is really helpful for being able to map the extent of the village and later occupations. Because when you have those artifacts from those shovel tests, you can kind of map out how they're distributed. It also gives us a window on the soil, so we can tie the shovel tests with the GPR to help interpret it better. And I'll just give you a quick example. You can see these are shovel test here, that's with the profile here, shovel test here. And notice this shovel test is in one of these red and yellow areas, really reflective in the GPR. And consistent with that, you probably can't see it too well in this photo, but there's a lot of shell in the profile here. This one is in one of these kind of darker areas, no shell in the profile. So it helps us interpret what's going on with the GPR. The two kinds of data are complementary. But of course the artifacts are a big part of the shovel test data, so we can collect these artifacts. This is good safety harbor pottery. These ticked rims, which you get down here in Sarasota too, in the safety harbor period. The punctation of the incised pottery. And we can map out the distribution of pottery. This is actually, can barely read those. That's Native American ceramics over there. And this is shell in shovel tests. And you can see this is also kind of another indication of the two arms of the village that the archaeologists described in the 1940s. So we're finding a pattern of a plaza here in the middle that was probably unoccupied, maybe used for ceremonial purposes. So mapping out the extent of the village. Here's some other types of artifacts associated with Tokabaga. We're getting a lot of stone projectile points, these arrow points. A lot of shells, of course, and shell tools. This is a shell plummet on the right, an ornament that would have been worn. And then, you know, the Spanish stuff, and we're not finding a lot of it. It seems to have been very concentrated right where they built a picnic shelter. And the amateur archaeologists that excavated in the 70s got a lot of Spanish pottery there. We're getting a little bit on the edges. So this is a piece of Spanish olive jar up at the top, and we have some features in the shovel test right next to the picnic shelter. I mean, literally feet from the picnic shelter that look like they could be associated with a Spanish structure, perhaps. They look different than some of the features from out in the Native American village, the Tokabaga village. So a little bit of Spanish stuff, but not a lot. It looks like the Spanish occupation was really kind of clustered in that one area, which might be the case because things weren't going so well, right? And we are also picking up artifacts associated with Philippe and potentially with his enslaved laborers. So things like these 19th century ceramics, a clay tobacco pipe fragment, metal buttons, and we can map those out too and see that Philippe's plantation seems to have maybe a structure down here and a structure up there too. One of them may be Philippe's house, one of them may be a structure associated with these slaves. Of course, we also get a lot of stuff from the modern development of the park. So we see in some cases, and this is one of the challenges, and one of the things I think will be a contribution to this work for managing this site better, because we can get perfectly preserved midden in the shovel test here, and then 60 feet away, we get concrete buried down 3 or 4 feet, or we get cement pipes or PVC pipes. So we're able to map out, we're going to be able to map out in much better detail what parts of the site are preserved and need to be protected and not have water lines put across them, and what parts maybe are not so well preserved. And I'll throw this in, associated maybe with the drama that I talked about, this weird cutout piece of copper. It looks like somebody made a fake arrowhead out of copper, that I'm wondering if it could be like a stage prop associated with one of those productions from the 50s and 60s. We don't know. We did do some larger excavations, and these provide a better window. You know, with the shovel tests are so small that you don't see as many features like posts and pits, and you don't get as many artifacts. So we did a couple larger test excavations, and you can see those here. This one I was really excited about. You can see really nicely preserved shellman here with this feature cutting across it. And I was like, oh, this could be the wall from the Spanish settlement, right? Dig down into it. But the other test unit did do better. You can't see it real well here, but this is the floor. It looks like maybe a floor of an occupation service where there was a lot of pottery lying flat. And an interesting part of it is that there are two kind of distinct mid-layers. So that's another thing we want to do, is kind of tease apart the Native American occupation. prior to this work, all we knew that it was the Safety Harbor site was occupied about the time the Spanish came. But we didn't know how far back that occupation went. And we want to tell a more complete sort of nuanced history of that Native American village. And that kind of indicates that there might have been a break in occupation at some point where there's an earlier village and maybe people moved away or they shifted the settlement and then reoccupied this part. And you can also see some features at the floor of this excavation, some post holes and pits associated with native houses. Like I said, you know, archaeology is a slow, long process. So we are still processing artifacts, counting shells, weighing shells, sorting pottery. I hope that within, you know, the end of the year or so that we'll be able to put this together into you know, a report that the county can use to kind of better manage this national historic landmark and preserve it for future generations. And of course, we're also doing kind of more specialized analyses, a lot of radiocarbon dating. We've got about a dozen radiocarbon dates now that go back to the 1100s or so and continue up into the 1400s, 1500s. So that's part of telling that story about the Native American village. Ultimately, like I said, we're trying to tell the story of Tokabaga, and I'd like to close with this old newspaper article from the St. Pete Times called Philippe Park, History Underfoot, and it says, there are many stories about the park. Some of them may be true. And so wow. I see that as part of my job is to kind of sort out what's true and what's not about the park. So I thank you guys for coming here instead of the opera. Happy to